Well, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Howard. This is a true pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to see this field growing step by step, and I think not without you and Barnaby's efforts, because I think without you, we would not have such a chance to really bring the best of the wisdom scholars into one room, at least for a day. As some of you know, I'm interested in I'm an experimental psychologist, and I'm interested in ways to measure wisdom, as Howard discussed. Let's first establish the common ground. I do not mean to talk about wisdom writ large, which may include various components that Dilip, for instance, mentioned. Today, I will particularly focus on expression of wisdom, reasoning in particular, intellectual virtues, if you want, in difficult life situations. For me, as an experimental psychologist, this is very important because I want to understand process, possibly understand connections to neuroscience, to physiology, to various aspects of what's actually happening to people when they happen to be in those difficult situations. And to establish the common ground, the process that I will be referring to are those that Paul Balthasar and Ursula talked about earlier, but as well as many others. And I recently also summarized again. It includes humility, intellectual humility in particular, recognition of uncertainty, limits of your knowledge, consideration of different perspectives, and integration of these perspectives. So as well, when I'm talking about wisdom here, I mean specifically this wise reasoning. There were a few observations that I made and presented in this forum over the course of the last few years. Number one, the within-person variability in wise reasoning is larger than between-person variability, which means that the chance of you measuring wisdom once and finding the same level of wisdom on the next day, if you measure it again, well, would be about you can take a square root of 20 of 0.2. It's not very high. The generally within-person variability is wider. This is between-person variability, suggesting that within the same person you see more range in wisdom than between two individuals on average. There's also greater bang for the buck. There will be a few talks that will deal with well-being in a bit, and findings are mixed. One possible reasons why they're mixed, as we addressed in this paper, is that if you look at the individual level of analysis from one stage to the next, what predicts well-being, what predicts forgiveness, what predicts emotional balance, you find stronger relationship than if you just look on average at the responses, like how on average somebody, how wise somebody is on average, how emotionally balanced would that same person be on average. So that's the first observation. The second observation, another thing that I presented earlier, experimental work that I've conducted. Dilip, there are a few papers that you know, of course, that deal with interventions, specifically with interventions of wisdom or wise reasoning. The two of them, one, the initial study, and the pre-registered independent replication, that also includes some component of values, deals with the topic of self-other context. Again, something that Ursula and Paul Balthasar worked a little bit earlier on. We sort of refined it, made it a little bit tighter, and found that if you think about a friend being cheated on, you are much more likely to recognize limits of your knowledge, compromise, consider change, different outcomes, than if you think the same thing will happen to you. If you take a self-distant perspective on yourself, think about yourself in the third person, you can improve your tendency to reason wisely, even about your personal problems. And we found that both among the young and older adults and so on. So those things together suggested an interesting challenge. Number one, you need situation-specific assessment to obtain a fuller picture of wisdom. These experimental effects, you could not obtain them if you just use some kind of general trait-level abstract scales of wisdom. Number two, it's also very hard to obtain a reliable and valid estimate of wisdom without understanding the context. And this is, again, something that Paul Balthasar has been writing about for a long time. And now we have even more experimental data and also diary data suggesting that that's indeed the case. Another implication that I wrote about in the perspective is that probably major trait-like wisdom scales and some of the people in the audience may not like me for that, are subject to social desirability bias and are not sensitive to situation. Now, the second part is a fact. They are not supposed to be. They are supposed to be abstract. They are supposed to get us to general tendencies. But by doing that, we miss a big picture of what wisdom may be about, namely the interaction of the person in the context. Our reasoning did not evolve as Mercer and Sperber, for instance, in the recent book from this year, wrote, to just think on our own. It may have evolved to think in relationship to other people. And so if we miss that, we miss what maybe humanity is all about. So to address this challenge, a student of mine who just recently finished his PhD, Justin Brienza, and I and a large group of others have worked on a new state-level measurement instrument that can bridge the quality that you will get from situation-specific responses, such as done in content analysis that Paul and Ursula has done, and myself and Judith Gluck, and some form of question. It's a compromise. On the one hand, you still get a cheaper version because it's a questionnaire. On the other hand, you will get more specific process-oriented responses. The way to do that, we thought, is first of all, you recall a specific out of a concrete experience that happened to people. You reconstruct this experience, which is very important. And Danny Kahneman has this technique. Day reconstruction is also refined event reconstruction, where you recall specifics of the experience to help you avoid some of the memory recall biases. And after that, we, in this case, use 21 items that we developed based on this framework. But of course, this measure can be adapted, and I welcome everybody to adopt it to any domains that you want, be it emotion regulation, be it some forms of prosociality, or even spirituality. The idea is really more of a conceptual one, and we just demonstrated here with respect to wise reasoning. Now, what I will present to you very briefly, we don't have much time, some steps that we have taken to validate this measure. Close to half, for about 5,000 people by now, and ongoing across different cultural groups, respect to biases, balancing of goals, which Bob may find interesting, given his general definition of wisdom, as well as some specific contextual inferences that we can draw from that. All the data, including all the information, including every single step of analysis, is available online. You can download it. This is the largest paper I've written. There are like 80 pages of the manuscript itself, plus 160 pages of supplement. So, but in the sense of rigorous, replicable science, this is probably the future. I will not present to you all of this, but we've taken 8 steps. Just generating items, look at the intra-individual variability, convergent discriminant validity, relationship to various individual differences, and then relationship to various forms of balance, balance of cooperative self-protective intentions, influence and adjustment goals, internal, external causal inferences, intra-individual reliability over time, as well as some contextual factors. So very briefly about the factor structure. It's beautiful. I mean, I've never seen that. I mean, I've been developing scales for a little bit, but this was really beautiful, where you have a beautiful master, like a clustering of items into 5 components. Each of them very solidly clustered together. The weakest one is actually outside its vintage point, but still quite strong here. All of them are loading substantially on this overall component. We did an initial test of convergent validity with trait-level wisdom scales, intergroup-wise reasoning, observer-rated wisdom scores, and discriminant validity to social desirability, bias, blind spot attributions. Now, so what you see here is the WR is the wise reasoning scales. This is the new one. SOS, 3DWS, and ASTIA, 3 of the most widely used wisdom, trait wisdom instruments. First of all, you see that there is a relationship, positive relationship between wise reasoning on the scale and each of these instruments, suggesting convergent validity, as well as to observer-rated wisdom on an independent task where we use content analysis. Now, what's really important here, and this is bad news for Monica and others. Sorry, Monica, not personal. And this is that this scale, the Weiss reasoning scale, is either unrelated. I mean, this 0.08 is negligible, effect size is really small, or negatively related to bias, blind spot, impression management, self-deception. All other scales are either positively related to bias or unrelated to attribution bias. So if you use one of those measures, you probably capture at least the same amount of self-deception impression management as you're measuring wisdom, probably in a reliable fashion. I will skip some of the individual difference measures, but I will focus on individual balance, because I think this has been central to the notion of wisdom, this idea of balancing different interests, interpersonal goals or societal goals. So let me look through present you some of that very briefly. We looked at influence versus adjustment goals. And for instance, we also looked at causal inferences. Is the person at fault or the other party at fault? And this is done on the level of the situation. I will skip this, but essentially what we use for each of those, we use the similarity intensity model of ambivalence to get at the notion that you're not extreme in one or another direction, but more moderate in the middle. And here we have SOS, 3DWS, ASTI, and Swiss is the situational scale, where we find that the trait level scales are either unrelated or negatively related to the influence and adjustment goals, so causal inference. In fact, most people won't just influence others according to the scales. Like, there's a positive relation between those. And they think the other person is at fault, whereas Swiss is positively related to those. We replicated this in another sample. Here we did it multiple times, multiple measurement points. So what we have is Judith Gluck had this kind of mini measure, trait measure. She just took 3 scales together, see what's the common, what are the highest loadings across the scales, and then picked, I think, 10 items or something. So we used that. But also now we can separate, because we measured it multiple times, trait and state level Swiss. So general tendency based on the average across multiple time points, and individual variability from this general tendency. And again, we see that this Swiss is positively related both on the trait and the state level, whereas the brief wisdom scale is negatively related to this balance tendency. So I'm not sure what they're capturing, but they're definitely not capturing balance. And if balance is important, according to Bob and others, then we're doing something wrong with those trait level scales. Overall, the intra-individual variability, we did it across years in study 1, a 0.48, not bad, and 0.29 across different scenarios in the same setting. And now what that means, if you translate that in Cronbach's alpha using a simple Spearman-Brown formula, so that Cronbach alpha is what psychologists are using for estimating reliability. And typically we say that 0.7 is our rule of thumb. That's OK if it's 0.7. Well, none of them is 0.7. None. So we're doing something wrong if we are assuming that wisdom is a trait and we want to measure it, and yet none of the measures actually gets to 0.7 in one setting. So what we need, it doesn't mean that it's not the time to despair. What we basically need is measure it more than once. According to some of these estimates, and this is both from some of the work that Judith has done, this PPS paper I showed earlier, and this current work, you need between 3 and 5 estimates to at least try 3. And that's a recommendation we have given in the paper, as well as in this other work. I will skip the contextual effects for now. There are some interesting gender by gender of the other person interactions. Take-home message that if you're a man talking to a woman, you may be wiser than if you're talking to a man, which is interesting, as certain societal norm probably playing into this. The other thing, just very briefly mentioned to you, is that you can use now this measure, for instance, to look at the relation to prosociality. It's not like that wisdom is generally related to prosociality. If you account for the level of the situations we published in this Nature paper, then prosociality will depend on the amount of time you spend, for instance, on a task. If you don't spend any time, your wisdom will not, your wise reasoning will not help you to become more prosocial. With more time, you become more prosocial if you're wiser than if you're not wise. If you're foolish, you actually become less. So, but anyway, so it's like this consideration of situation level, process-oriented level of analysis is important. You also have shown that you can experimentally boost it again in a set of follow-up studies in here. That's like for DILIP, another note. So in summary, there's a reliable new method, reliable according to conventions. Of course, there may be still some ways in which it is unreliable, and I welcome you all to sort of use it, come with suggestions. I have this white sheet of paper now, so for more suggestions from you. It's associated with balancing, influencing adjustment goals, self and other attributions. It's void of social desirability and impression management bias, a bias blind spot, a negative relate to attribution bias. And it enables detection of contextual effects, which is really important because to some extent that's what wisdom is all about, in my opinion, to understand how we interact, how we become wiser in a context. And as I've demonstrated earlier, and I think this measure can be very useful for showing how it can be experimentally facilitated for the interventions, for instance. How it can be trained, practiced, and developed. And as I mentioned already earlier, I wrote about this in a recent piece for European psychologists, that without understanding the cultural, historical, experiential, situational context, we really miss the picture how wisdom exemplars can be used, how wisdom can be trained. So that's all for today, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
The correlations among tests, although you refer to them as convergent validation, if this were a study on, say, intelligence, IQ, those would be the correlations for discriminant validation, because although they're significant, they're very low, and if you square them, you're talking about single digits of percent variance accounted for.
Yeah.
So what I'm wondering about is whether your results, and it can't be due to attenuation because your reliabilities were high, and presumably restriction of range isn't a big deal because you had so many subjects across, 4,500 subjects. So that means the correlations are probably correcting them wouldn't make that much difference. Does that suggest that wisdom is more state-like than trait-like, or that in terms of a future for those of us like myself who hoped that we could be talking about selecting for wise people and not so wise people or developing wise people, that the result is not so optimistic?
Well, to answer the first part of your comment, I think to really rule out the reliability issue, you need to ensure that both components are reliable. The scales that you evaluated against and the current scale. The current scale is reliable according to conventions. The other scales sometimes, not always, but some of those scales have issues with reliability. In this case, they were okay-ish, but it does pose a problem, nevertheless, even if you ruled all that out. And I think you can still, even if you just do it twice, you can still get a much better estimate. At the end, Bob, it's all about statistically, what is the, how comfortable you with this level of uncertainty about what you're measuring versus that level of uncertainty. The trait style scales impose a huge level of uncertainty on you. You may be measuring wisdom on the trait level, you may be measuring the property of the situation, or you may be measuring something entirely different, like social desirability bias. So that's, of course, a very negative picture. But if you're comfortable with, like 60 or 70% of uncertainty, then go for that scale. If you use it twice or 3 times maybe, then actually you will really reduce this uncertainty. And so, for instance, if you want to get the wise leader or get an assessment of a wise leader, observe the same person 2 or 3 times. You will even better in different contexts. I think we can really, with this very simple tweak, get around the issue. But I think also that if you want to have a scale that's give 10 items, and from these 10 items can get somebody's wisdom score, I don't think that's a good approach. It's not a good service for the field, It's also not, you will have just a huge degree of uncertainty that I, as a scientist, would not be comfortable with.
That was great, Igor. So I have two quick ones. So the first one's a little quicker, the second one's a little longer. So my first question is, when you were talking about the within-person variability and wisdom being larger than the between subject, I mean, is that true of any subjective measure, or is that something that's special about wisdom?
Okay, so that one, it's comparable to personality, to Big Five. Within-person variability is often, not always, but often larger. Aranda, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's, it's not, wisdom is not atypical in that. And it's also, Bob, to you, like, it's not that, like in personality, Big Five, we're not talking about lack of personality because it varies from one situation to the next. There is still a core. And I think what this data, to some extent, also demonstrate, there is a degree of stability. You just need to hedge it by measuring multiple times to really get a reliable estimate of that stable component.
And then the second part is, the thing that I do think may be kind of special about wisdom is that it's very easy for me to say, you know, assess my mood, you know, but assessing if I'm being wise seems more challenging. And I almost wonder if for these wisdom scales, should something different be implemented where you actually have other people judge, you know, someone's behavior rather than having the participant judge his or her.
It's a fair point. The issue there is that the same concern applies to observers. It's like, do people who know you well, can they really assess how intellectually humble you are? Well, they see you in certain contexts, and maybe there's less of a self-deception bias, but at the same time, they don't see you in other contexts, maybe. So I think ultimately one combination of both. The trick about here is, and I think, I mean, at least that's what Judith told me when she tried it on herself. She was my guinea pig, Judith Gluck. Is that because it's on the level of the situation and you ask to recall the experience, at least you're not as tempted to make up some kind of an abstract answer. What's a good thing to do? Like, and you ask very concrete things, like, did you check if there are other options? Did you consider different perspectives? You may still not remember if you did that, but at least you try through this event reconstruction to get that. But it's still a concern, of course.
Yeah, thanks.
Hey, thank you, Igor, for this great presentation, and you're doing fantastic work, you know, across a wide range of things. I do want to address the issue of social desirability a little bit, because if you do look at the scales, it's actually kind of often these scales tap into virtue and ethics. And so the question is, you know, if they are actually related, that might be because these people actually behave in these socially desirable ways, you know, which you hope that wise people actually do.
That's not correct.
So,
according to the modern research on social desirability, there are at least two components, according to Paulus, for instance, from UBC. One of them is controllable. And that one, I may agree with you there. The other one is actually uncontrollable.
And how did you measure it? Did you take only the extreme values?
No, I mean, I take
That's how you should do it.
No,
That's how
you should use the most rigorous scale there.
No, yeah, but do you only use, if you use, did you use the Paulus scale?
That's correct.
Did you only count the extreme
values? I did
values?
exactly what Paulus recommends.
You only counted the extreme values. That's what I'm saying, yes.
Yep. Yeah.
And so you're thinking it's not ethics?
Well, if one of them is uncontrollable, and it's not something that you should be consciously deliberating, monitoring, then that's not really...
Can you think of an example?
Well, bias blind spot is one example, for instance.
But the bias blind spot was not the problem, right? This was not the issue. That wasn't the bias blind spot. They weren't correlated with the wisdom scales.
Most scales were.
It was the Paulus scales, right?
No, most scales were also correlated to bias blind spot.
Okay, so I have it. Then I remember it incorrectly. But can you think of in the Paulus scales examples what you were just saying, that it's not ethics, it's something else? Well, I mean, again, I need to look. I mean, maybe we can discuss it afterwards for the sake of time. But
my understanding in general is if it's not controllable, if it's just about, if it's just something that you do, you're not aware of, if you're not aware of even aware of your bias, then for me it's really hard to make a deliberate argument of acting in a particular way because society wants me to act in a particular way.
Yeah, but that's not how it was. But we can discuss this at
Yeah.
another time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so just very, very quickly, Igor. So I'm just gonna, because we're out of time, I'm just gonna end with a compliment. So, Katie Finnegan and Simin Vizier had a paper in JPSP a couple of months ago where they critiqued experience sampling, right? Where they said that when you look at the relationship between experience sampling and informant reports, right? They don't really predict informant reports once you control for self-reported traits. And I think there are problems with the paper, but I think one implication is that I think people who do diary research and experience sampling haven't paid as much attention to their methods as they could have.
Right.
So I think one great thing about your study, with its emphasis on contextualized responses,
Right.
is that I think that actually represents a step forward in daily diary assessment. So I just want to compliment you on that.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to stop there.
Thank you, guys.